A special thank you to Andre, Jeffernan and Deborah Scrock, as well as many others for suggesting this video. If you have story ideas you'd like to see, please leave them in the comments below. What if I told you that the greatest unsolved mystery in American aviation history was never meant to be solved? That the man who vanished into the night sky over Washington state in 1971 wasn't a criminal at all, but a ghost created by the very government that spent decades pretending to hunt him. The story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about Daniel Cooper, and about who's really watching from the shadows. Act 1. The Vanishing Man. The rain hammered against the windows of the FBI Seattle field office on November the 24th, 1971, as Special Agent Wallace Grant stared at the preliminary report on his desk. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. The words on the page seemed impossible, yet dozens of witnesses confirmed the same thing. A man calling himself Dan Cooper had just hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305, extorted $200,000 in cash, demanded 4 parachutes, and jumped into the night somewhere over southwestern Washington. Polite, Grant muttered, reading the passenger descriptions. Calm. Methodical. He tapped his pen against the margin notes. Who the hell are you? The telex machine in the corner chattered to life, and Grant crossed the room to tear off the incoming message. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. From FA a Western Region to FB Seattle Field Office. Crew Flight 305 incident. Military radar blackout window confirmed 2010 to 2047 PST. No visual confirmation of parachute deployment. Search parameters expanded to 200-mile radius. Grant frowned. A radar blackout? That was the first he'd heard of it. He picked up the phone to call the FAA when his supervisor, Bill Rackham, appeared in the doorway. "Put it down, Wallace," Rackham said quietly. "Sir, this telex mentions a radar blackout I wasn't briefed on." "I said put it down." Rackham's voice carried an edge Grant had never heard before. "The case is being transferred to Division 5. You're to compile your notes and hand everything over by 0800 tomorrow. Division 5. Grant felt something cold settle in his chest. Division 5 was domestic counterintelligence. They handled Soviet infiltration, sedition cases, threats to national security. What did they want with a simple skyjacking? "Bill, what's going on?" Rackham moved closer, lowering his voice. "Nothing you need to worry about. This one's above both our pay grades. Just do as you're told and forget about Dan Cooper." But Grant couldn't forget. None of them could. And 54 years later, in a climate-controlled archive room 3,000 miles away, someone was about to discover why. Act 2. The Black File. Eleanor Reed had spent 37 years with the FBI, most of them in the Records Management Division, a job that sounded boring to everyone who asked, and was exactly as boring as it sounded. She'd filed reports, digitized old case files, and watched younger agents climb the ladder while she remained comfortably anonymous in the basement archives. Now, at 62 and 6 months into retirement, she'd been called back for a special project, digitizing the remaining Norjack files, the Bureau's code name for the Dan Cooper investigation. It was simple work, scanning old documents and cross-referencing them in the database, but Eleanor didn't mind. The extra money helped, and there was something oddly satisfying about handling pieces of history. She was 3 weeks into the project when she found it. The file had been misfiled in a box labelled Hijacking Incidents 1968 to 1970, placed between reports on 2 forgotten cases. The folder itself was unremarkable. Standard manila, slightly yellowed with age, but the stamp across the front made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Project Cooper Directive. Eyes only, classification. Top secret authorized personnel only. Eleanor glanced toward the archive room door. She was alone, as usual. The senior archivist wouldn't be back from lunch for another 20 minutes. Her hand hesitated over the folder before curiosity won out. Inside were approximately 40 pages of documents, memos, and handwritten notes. The first page was a summary brief dated November 15th, 1971, 9 days before the hijacking. Memorandum for Division 5, Assistant Director from Special Projects Liaison, Office of Technical Service. Subject: Operation Cooper Directive, Phase 1, Authorization. This is to confirm joint operation authorization between Bureau Division 5 and Central Intelligence Agency Office of Technical Service for the execution of controlled hijack simulation exercise, codenamed Cooper Directive. Objective: Measure public response parameters to civilian aviation threat scenario. Assess media amplification patterns, law enforcement coordination efficiency, and population anxiety metrics over extended timeline. Operational window: November 20th to 30th, 1971, asset designation. Subject: D. Cooper. Civilian contract, non-disclosure binding. Scenario: simulated ransom hijacking, Northwest Orient Airlines, Seattle-Tacoma route controlled variables, pre-positioned parachutes, inert test models, marked currency, sequential serials, CIA counterfeit division, predetermined egress coordinates. Eleanor read the words 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding. A controlled simulation. But Dan Cooper was real. Witnesses saw him. The airline confirmed the hijacking. The FBI had searched for months. She turned to the next page. An operational timeline with minute-by-minute checkpoints. Most had neat check marks beside them, but at 2039 PST someone had written in red ink, "Subject deviated from protocol. Deployed personal chute. No radio contact." And below that, in different handwriting, shakier, "Subject did not deploy test chute, took cash and documents. Possible defection. Contain. Documents?" Eleanor flipped through more pages, finding a manifest of items supposedly aboard Flight 305. Most were expected. The money bag, parachutes, fuel calculations. But near the bottom, someone had added a handwritten note. Courier package confirmed sewn into currency bundles. Contents: microfilm archives, Operation Chaos subject files, preliminary Watergate documentation, priority recovery. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Operation Chaos was the CIA's illegal domestic surveillance program, exposed years later during the Church Committee hearings. Watergate documentation, before the break-in was even public knowledge. She photographed every page with her phone, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just a cold case file. This was evidence of something far larger, something that powerful people had worked very hard to bury. As she replaced the folder exactly where she'd found it, Eleanor noticed one final detail that made her stomach drop. The last page was a distribution list of everyone who'd received copies of the directive. 14 names. Beside 11 of them, someone had drawn a small red X. And at the bottom, in fresh ink that couldn't be more than a few years old, "Monitoring ongoing, containment protocol active." Eleanor locked the archive room behind her and walked to her car on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She didn't notice the grey sedan that pulled out 3 cars behind her, maintaining a careful distance all the way to her apartment in Silver Spring. Act 3. The Surviving Asset. Thomas Harkins lived in a modest ranch house outside Olympia, Washington, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that blocked most of the sunlight. Eleanor had tracked him down through the operational files. He'd been an airfield technician at McCord Air Force Base in 1971, one of the few names on the distribution list without a red X. When he opened the door, she saw a man who'd aged far beyond his 87 years. His hands shook slightly, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. "Mr. Harkins, my name is Eleanor Reed. I worked for the FBI Records Division, and I need to ask you about something that happened in November 1971. His face went pale. "You should go. Please. I found the Cooper Directive files. I know it was a simulation. I know something went wrong." Harkins gripped the doorframe. "If you found those files, you're already in danger. They don't let people like you just walk away with that kind of knowledge." "Then help me understand what I'm walking away from." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all you get. His living room was sparse, a worn couch, a television, photos of grandchildren on the mantel. Harkins didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he moved to the window and peered through the curtains at the empty street. "I was just a technician," he began, his voice low. 23 years old, fresh out of technical school. In early November, they brought me into a secure hangar and told me I'd been selected for a classified logistics assignment. All I had to do was prepare 4 parachutes according to very specific modifications. What kind of modifications? 2 of them were real, standard military reserve chutes, fully functional. The other 2 were test models, inert. They'd open, but they weren't designed to support a person's weight for more than a few seconds, just long enough to make it look real if anyone happened to spot the drop. Eleanor felt sick. They were going to kill him! No, Harkins shook his head. That's what I thought at first too, but the asset, Cooper, he was supposed to take the inert chutes. He knew which ones they were. The whole plan was for him to jump with an inert chute, deploy it for visual confirmation, then cut away and deploy his personal rig. He'd land at predetermined coordinates where a recovery team was waiting. Clean extraction, controlled environment, perfect psychop to study public response to aviation terror. But he didn't follow the plan. He took the real chutes, and he took something they didn't expect him to take. Harkins returned to the window, his paranoia evident. The money wasn't the prize. Inside the currency bundle sewn into the fabric of the money bag itself was a courier package. Microfilm. Dozens of rolls containing names, addresses and photographs of deep-cover CIA operatives working domestic assignments. People who'd been exposed by intelligence leaks inside the agency. Why would they transport something like that on a civilian flight? Because no one would think to look there. It was supposed to be a quick handoff. Cooper gets the money bag, jumps, recovery team secures the package, case goes into the books as an unsolved mystery. But Cooper realised what he had. Those weren't just names on film. Those were leverage, insurance, proof that the agency was running illegal operations on American soil. He defected. That's one word for it. I'd say he made a business decision. Someone inside the operation tipped him off about what was really in that bag. He grabbed the intel and vanished, and the people who designed the whole thing couldn't exactly file a police report saying their fake hijacker stole their illegal surveillance records. Eleanor pulled out her phone and showed him the photo of the distribution list. 11 of these people are dead, marked with red X's. Harkins barely glanced at it. 12 now. Martin Kellerman died 3 months ago. Heart attack, they said. He was 59 and ran marathons. His jaw tightened. Everyone connected to the directive has been systematically eliminated over the past 2 decades. I'm alive because I was nobody. A technician who prepared parachutes and kept his mouth shut. But you found the file, which means someone made a mistake. The mistakes get corrected. I need to know who's doing the correcting. You're asking the wrong question. You should be asking why they're still correcting mistakes from an operation that's 50 years old. He finally met her eyes. The Cooper case never closed because it was never supposed to close. Think about it. How many unsolved mysteries stay in the public consciousness for half a century? How many trigger thousands of amateur investigations, documentaries, books, conspiracy theories? You're saying the mystery itself is intentional? I'm saying the mystery is the experiment. They wanted to see how long they could keep a story alive through cultural reinforcement. No closure, no resolution, just perpetual speculation. The perfect case study in long-term social engineering. Dan Cooper isn't a person anymore, he's a phenomenon. And someone is still managing that phenomenon. Eleanor's mind reeled. Who? I don't know names. But after I left McCord, I did some digging. Found references to something called Operation Horizon Wing, a continuation program funded through discretionary intelligence budgets. Its mandate was behavioral containment following hijack simulation incident. That was in 1973. It's been refined, privatized, and expanded since then. Last I heard, it was being run through a DARPA contractor specializing in psychological operations and narrative control. That's insane. That's classified. He handed her a slip of paper with an address. There's someone who knows more than I do. Greg Larson, investigative journalist, specialises in government transparency cases. If anyone can help you make sense of this, it's him. But Eleanor, understand something. The moment you go public with this, you become a loose thread. And they're very good at trimming loose threads. She tucked the paper into her pocket. Why are you helping me? For the first time, something like a smile crossed his weathered face. Because I'm 87 years old and I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe it's time someone finally cut the strings. Act 4, The Shadow Investigation. Greg Larson worked out of a converted warehouse in Portland's industrial district, surrounded by filing cabinets, conspiracy corkboards, and enough encryption equipment to make the NSA nervous. When Eleanor arrived with her documentation, he spent 3 hours verifying the files before he said a single word. Finally, he sat back and removed his reading glasses. This is real. I know. No, I mean this is really real. I've chased government ghosts for 15 years, and most of it's smoke and mirrors. But this? He gestured at the document spread across his desk. This is actionable, verifiable, court-admissible evidence of a domestic psychop. Do you understand what you found? I understand that people have died to keep it buried. Then you understand we need to be extremely careful. He pulled up several databases on his computer. I've been tracking anomalies in the Norjack case for years. There are inconsistencies that never made sense until now. He showed her aerial photographs from 1980, when a young boy found $5,800 of Cooper's ransom money, partially buried along the Columbia River at Bar. The FBI made a big deal about this discovery. They said it proved Cooper died in the jump and the money washed downstream. But look at the serial numbers. Eleanor leaned closer. They matched the currency manifest. Except they shouldn't exist. Greg pulled up another file. I obtained records from the CIA's Technical Services Division through a FOA request 6 years ago. Buried in thousands of pages of budgetary documentation was a line item for currency reproduction services provided to Fort Belvoir in late 1971. Fort Belvoir is where the Army runs its counterfeit detection and production facility. They made fake bills with the same serial numbers. Test bills. For training purposes, officially. But here's the thing. The money found at Bar was weathered, but not consistently. Some bills showed severe degradation, others were barely affected. That's not how natural exposure works. The weathering was staged. They planted Cooper's money to close the case, to stabilise the narrative. By 1980, the story was getting stale. They needed a development to keep it alive, to make it feel like progress was being made. A small discovery, enough to generate headlines, but not enough to actually solve anything. It's brilliant in a deeply disturbing way. Eleanor felt the pieces aligning in her mind. Harkins mentioned Operation Horizon Wing, a behavioural containment program. Greg's fingers flew across his keyboard. Let me check something. He accessed what appeared to be a classified database. Eleanor didn't ask how. Here. Internal CIA memorandum dated April 1973 from Richard Helms to the Director of the Office of Technical Service. The scanned document appeared on screen. R.E. Operation Horizon Wing. Quarterly assessment. Public myth successfully stabilised following subject's unplanned extraction. Media amplification parameters within acceptable ranges. Civilian investigation efforts show predicted patterns of obsessive focus without resolution demand. Recommendation. Continue monitoring cultural reinforcement mechanisms. Maintain periodic evidence discoveries to sustain engagement without closure. Current timeline projects sustained public interest for minimum 25-year cycle. Budget allocation. Approved under discretionary domestic analysis programs. Transition to private contractor oversight recommended by 1985 to minimize institutional liability. 25 years minimum, Eleanor whispered. It's been 54. Because it worked better than they ever imagined. The Cooper legend became self-sustaining. People didn't need the government to keep it alive. They did it themselves. But someone still needs to manage it, to make sure it doesn't drift too far from the useful narrative. Who's managing it now? Greg pulled up a corporate registry. The program was privatized in 1987, transferred to a company called Horizon Analytics. which was later absorbed by Sentinel Cognitive Systems in 2003. Sentinel holds multiple contracts with DARPA's Behavioural Sciences Division. Their specialty is narrative architecture and long-term social pattern analysis. That sounds like Orwellian nightmare fuel. It gets better. Sentinel's CEO is a woman named Patricia Koenig. Want to guess where she worked before going private? CIA, Division 5 of the FBI. She was 17 years old when the Cooper hijacking happened, but by 1983 she was running psychological operations for Bureau Counterintelligence. She has the institutional knowledge, the clearances, and the resources to keep this thing alive indefinitely. Eleanor stood and paced the warehouse floor. So what do? We can't exactly file a police report. We leak it, not to mainstream media. They're too compromised, too afraid of losing access. We go to independent platforms, multiple sources simultaneously. We flood the zone with documentation before they can contain it. And then we see if the truth can survive contact with the people who've been lying about it for 5 decades. Greg began organising the files. I'll need 48 hours to verify secondary sources and set up deadman switches. If anything happens to either of us, the documentation auto-releases to 24 outlets. You think they'd really kill us over this? He met her eyes with an expression that was almost pitying. Eleanor, they've already killed 11 people. We're just 2 more loose threads. Act 5. The truth buried in plain sight. They worked through the night, building an unassailable case. Greg had contacts in cryptography who verified the document's authenticity. Eleanor cross-referenced names and dates with public records, building timelines that proved the government's narrative had been manufactured from the beginning. By dawn, they had everything ready for release. That's when Greg's phone rang. He checked the screen and frowned. "Unknown number," he answered on speaker. "Larson." The voice that came through was distorted, digitally masked. "Mr. Larson, Miss Reed, you've both been very busy." Eleanor felt ice flood her veins. "You have information that doesn't belong to you," the voice continued. "Information that could cause significant disruption to ongoing research initiatives. We're prepared to offer you a choice. Walk away now, destroy everything you've compiled, and return to your lives with no consequences. Or proceed with your planned disclosure and face legal action for theft of classified materials, conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act, and unauthorized disclosure of national defense information." Greg leaned toward the phone. "Who is this?" "I'm someone who appreciates thoroughness, Mr. Larson. Your investigation has been impressive, but you're missing the larger picture. The Cooper Directive wasn't a mistake or a conspiracy. It was research, valuable research that continues to produce actionable intelligence on social behavioural patterns. You're admitting the government staged a hijacking and has been manipulating the public for 50 years. I'm admitting that understanding how populations process, remember, and mythologize unsolved events is crucial to national security. The Cooper case has provided decades of data on collective memory, conspiracy theory formation, and the relationship between mystery and cultural identity. That research has applications far beyond a single hijacking. It informs counterterrorism strategy, disinformation detection, and crisis communication protocols. Eleanor found her voice. People died. 11 people on that distribution list were murdered to protect your research. Natural causes, accidents, and unfortunate timing. You're seeing patterns that don't exist, Miss Reed. Confirmation bias is a powerful thing, as our research has repeatedly demonstrated. Then you won't mind if we publish what we found. A pause. You'll find that difficult without your documentation. Greg's face went white. He pulled up his encrypted drives. Empty. The cloud backups. Gone. Every file they'd compiled, every photograph Eleanor had taken, wiped clean as if they'd never existed. How? Did you really think we wouldn't notice a retired FBI archivist accessing restricted files? That we wouldn't monitor a journalist with a history of investigating classified programs? You were never in control of this investigation, Mr. Larson. We simply allowed you to believe you were, so we could assess your methodology and identify any other potential security breaches. Eleanor pulled out her phone. The photos were gone. Even the originals, backed up to her personal cloud, deleted. "The files in the archive room," she said desperately. "The Cooper Directive folder was removed from the National Archives 3 days ago and appropriately reclassified. There is no record of its existence. There is no record of this conversation. In approximately 90 seconds, this phone will disconnect and all trace of this call will be erased." "You can't just erase the truth." "Miss Reed, we've been erasing, reshaping and managing truth for longer than you've been alive. The Cooper case is just one of hundreds of ongoing social research programs. Every major unsolved mystery of the past century has been carefully studied for its psychological impact. Some occur naturally. Some we engineer. All of them teach us something valuable about human nature." The line crackled with static. 60 seconds. I suggest you both return to your normal lives. Mr. Larson, your next article on municipal corruption will be well received. Miss Reed, enjoy your retirement, but understand, you are now part of our research database. Any future attempts to investigate this matter will be noted and addressed accordingly. Wait, Greg started. The line went dead. They sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Greg immediately tried to verify what the caller had said, checking and rechecking his drives, his backups, his fail-safes. Everything was gone. Not just deleted, erased at a level that suggested direct access to his systems despite multiple layers of encryption. "This is impossible," he muttered. "I had these files distributed across 6 different networks. They couldn't have accessed all of them. Unless they'd been monitoring from the beginning," Eleanor thought. Unless every move they'd made had been observed, catalogued, and allowed to proceed just far enough to identify any security weaknesses. She walked to the window and stared out at the grey Portland morning. Somewhere in this city, in this country, people were going about their lives completely unaware that their government had spent half a century running psychological experiments on them disguised as unsolved mysteries. "They win," she said quietly. "No." Greg's voice was firm. "They don't get to win. We have no evidence, no files, no proof of anything. If we try to tell this story, we sound like conspiracy theorists. We have nothing. We have our testimony. We have what we saw, what we learned. We can still what? Get dismissed as crazy? Get disappeared? They're monitoring us, Greg. They've made that clear. The moment we become more trouble than we're worth, we end up like the other 11 people on that list." He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face, but he knew she was right. They'd lost. Act 6. The Final Broadcast. Eleanor returned to her apartment that afternoon, feeling hollowed out. The grey sedan was gone. They didn't need to follow her anymore. She was contained, neutralised, no longer a threat. She made tea she didn't drink and sat by the window watching the street below. Normal people doing normal things, unaware that the reality they lived in was being carefully curated by people in windowless rooms who viewed human behaviour as data points to be collected and analysed. The mailbox buzzer startled her from her thoughts. She took the elevator down to the lobby, expecting bills or junk mail. Instead, she found a small padded envelope with no return address, just her name written in block letters. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive and a paper label that read, Flight 305, Recovered Audio. Eleanor's hand shook as she carried it back upstairs. This was a trap, it had to be. They were testing her, seeing if she'd learned her lesson. But she couldn't stop herself from plugging it into her laptop. A single audio file. She clicked play. Static filled her speakers, the harsh crackle of old radio transmission. Then, through the noise, a voice. "Ground control, this is Cooper." Confirming egress at designated coordinates. More static. Then a different voice, calm and professional. "Negative, Cooper. You're not at designated coordinates. Abort extraction. Repeat, abort extraction and proceed to..." "Negative, ground control. I'm exactly where I need to be." "Cooper, you're in violation of operational protocol. Return to dash. "Protocol?" The voice that had to be Cooper laughed. "Let me tell you about protocol. The people you work for just tried to kill me with faulty equipment. The people I work for just tried to buy me with someone else's secrets. I don't work for anyone anymore." "Cooper, listen carefully. The cargo you're carrying is classified beyond your clearance level. If you do not return it immediately, you will be designated a hostile asset and what? You'll what exactly? File an official report saying your fake hijacker stole your illegal surveillance files? Tell the FBI that your psychological operation went rogue? I don't think so. A long pause filled with static. Then a third voice. Older. Authoritative. Mr. Cooper, my name is Richard Helms. I believe we should discuss terms. The recording cut out. Eleanor replayed it 3 times, trying to process what she was hearing. But it was the background sound that finally made her pause. Beneath the voices, beneath the static, there was a steady rhythmic hum. Mechanical. Precise. She isolated the background frequencies using audio software and felt her skin crawl. The hum matched the signature of VLF transmissions, very low-frequency radio waves used for communicating with submarines. The technology existed in 1971, but these particular modulation patterns, this specific encryption scheme, weren't developed until the late 1990s. Someone had faked this recording. Recently. But why send it to her? Why now, after they'd wiped all her evidence and warned her to stay silent? Unless this was the next phase of their research. They'd contained the immediate threat, deleted the hard evidence, but now they wanted to see what she'd do with ambiguous information. Would she investigate further? Would she try to verify the audio? Would she learn from her mistakes, or would she keep pulling at threads they'd deliberately left loose? She was still part of their experiment. She'd always been part of it. Eleanor closed her laptop and sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment. Somewhere, analysts were noting her behavioural response, updating their models of how retired FBI archivists process suppressed information. The research never ended. The observation never stopped. She thought about Thomas Harkins living in fear for 50 years, about Greg Larson, whose career investigating government secrets had probably been monitored and guided more than he'd ever know, about Dan Cooper himself, whoever he really was, jumping into the night with secrets that powerful people desperately wanted back. The smart thing to do was delete the audio and forget everything. Return to retirement, pretend none of this had happened. But Eleanor had never been particularly smart about knowing when to quit. She copied the audio file to 3 different cloud services using 3 different encryption methods. She sent anonymous copies to 5 journalists she'd never contacted before. She uploaded it to 4 different conspiracy forums using a VPN and burner email addresses. If they wanted her to be part of their research, she'd show them what uncontrolled variables looked like. Within 2 hours, the audio was spreading across the internet. Within 6 hours, major news outlets were reporting on newly surfaced Cooper hijacking audio. Within 12 hours, the FBI had issued a statement calling it a hoax. Eleanor waited for the knock on her door, for the consequences she knew were coming. Instead, she received a text from an unknown number. Interesting choice. Data collection continuing. Thank you for your participation. She stared at the message until her screen went dark. They'd won after all, because even her rebellion was useful to them. Epilogue. The Loop. Present day. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Digital Archives. Case file. Norjack. DB Cooper investigation. At 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time, the case status updated automatically. Status: ongoing evaluation. Last modified. Current date modified by DCOPER71. The change triggered no alarms. The system had been making similar updates every few months for years, each time from the same user account that technically didn't exist in any official database. In Seattle, a cybersecurity researcher noticed the update while doing routine archive scraping for a documentary project. She screenshotted the metadata, intending to write a blog post about government database quirks. Her computer crashed before she could save the file. In Portland, Greg Larson received an email from a source claiming to have new information about the Cooper case. The attached files were encrypted with a key he'd never seen before. When he tried to decrypt them, his entire server farm went offline for 6 hours. When the systems came back up, the email was gone. In Silver Spring, Eleanor Reed woke from a dream she couldn't quite remember. Something about parachutes and static and a voice saying, they were never passengers, they were observers. She made coffee and checked the news. The Cooper audio she'd leaked had been thoroughly debunked by experts who had determined it was a digital fabrication created using modern software. The story had already faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer mysteries, fresher conspiracies. She opened her laptop to check her email and found a notification that her FBI pension had been increased by 3%. No explanation, just an automated message thanking her for her years of service. She closed the laptop. Through her window, she watched morning commuters rushing to catch buses and trains. Normal people living normal lives. But somewhere in that crowd, she knew there were observers, analysts, people who studied the patterns of daily life and measured how populations responded to the stories they were told. The Cooper case would never be solved because it was never meant to be solved. It was a perpetual experiment in controlled mystery, and she had just proven that even people who knew they were being manipulated couldn't escape the manipulation. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Newly discovered evidence in Zodiac killer case sparks renewed investigation. Eleanor almost laughed. The cycle never ended. The research continued. And somewhere in a secure facility that didn't appear on any map, analysts were already measuring public response to the latest chapter in another carefully managed unsolved mystery. At SeaTac International Airport, security cameras captured thousands of faces every hour. Most were logged and deleted after 72 hours, lost in the endless stream of travellers moving through the terminal. But at 2:23 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in the present day, a facial recognition algorithm flagged something unusual. A man, tall, approximately 6 feet, dark suit, narrow tie, carrying a vintage briefcase that dated to the early 1970s. The system attempted age regression analysis based on known photographs from the Cooper case, but the man's face was angled away from the camera at precisely the moment that would have provided the clearest image. The only clear shot captured him at the TSA checkpoint, placing his briefcase on the conveyor belt. Just before the metal detector, he turned toward the camera and smiled. The image was flagged for review, assigned a reference number and forwarded to a database that, officially, didn't exist. By the time a human analyst viewed the footage 6 hours later, the man was gone, vanished into the crowds like a ghost who'd never been real to begin with. The analyst made a note in the file, closed the window and returned to monitoring the next unsolved mystery. Somewhere a clock was ticking. Somewhere an experiment was still running. And somewhere a man who might or might not have been Daniel Cooper was smiling at the cameras, knowing that the greatest trick he'd ever pulled was making them think he'd disappeared in the first place. The game wasn't over. It had never really begun. What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet, a vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight join Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza Plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid. his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Doctor?" "Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. "I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones." As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall, "do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations. Seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments, and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, no ornate decorations celebrating his divine status, just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention: the acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex, a resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you have seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous, very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water, not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding. but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here. But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood? He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels. When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it. Hassan studied the drawing. You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite. Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza Plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment, Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented. Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary. The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. Karim, look at this. Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north. It's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where two underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance, they had been searching for specific energetic conditions. Hassan, Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face. Your grandfather's stories. Did any of them mention lights? Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination? No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena. Hassan's eyes widened slightly. Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces, but transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. Dr. Chen, she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released. Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, Clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the King's chamber, 1 behind the Queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Have there been any attempts to access them? Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. That's where things become political. In 2017, an international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression." Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. "What do you think is in the sealed chambers?" he asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. "There's something else, Doctor," Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. "It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes," Dr. Solomon said, "as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional." Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant. It was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically? Millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fiber optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. "Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery." As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realised he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. Dr. Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price. Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper, affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected, altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realized that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the king's chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery, it was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, they could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, it was a machine for expanding human potential, built by a civilization that understood the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. But why had this knowledge been lost, and why were modern authorities so determined to prevent its rediscovery? As dawn approached and the electromagnetic readings began to fluctuate with the rising sun, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his research, and possibly his life. He wasn't going to publish his findings in academic journals where they could be dismissed or suppressed. He was going to find a way to demonstrate the pyramid's true capabilities to the world. The Age of Secrets was about to end. 3 weeks after his night in the King's Chamber, Marcus found himself in a secure conference room at Cairo University, surrounded by researchers who had responded to his carefully worded communications. Dr. Solomon sat across from him, along with Dr. James Morrison, a British archaeoacoustic specialist, Dr. Elena Kozloff, a Russian electromagnetic researcher, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a Lakota physicist who studied indigenous sacred sites in North America. "What you're suggesting, Doctor?" "Chen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing Marcus's data on his tablet, "goes beyond revolutionary. You're proposing that ancient civilizations possess technology that we're only beginning to understand." Marcus nodded, pulling up a global map on the room's display screen. Red dots marked locations across every continent. It's not just a proposal anymore. Thanks to Dr. Running Bear's research, we've identified 47 sites worldwide that show identical electromagnetic signatures to the Great Pyramid. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "My people have always known that certain places were different. We called them places where the earth speaks, the acoustic properties, the electromagnetic anomalies, the consciousness-altering effects. They're all documented in our oral traditions." She pointed to several dots in North America: Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Medicine Wheels of Wyoming, certain kivas in the southwest. They all show the same engineering principles: positioning at electromagnetic convergence points, internal geometries designed for acoustic resonance, materials chosen for their piezoelectric properties. Dr. Kozloff, who had been quietly analysing electromagnetic data, looked up with excitement. "I've been comparing the frequency patterns from these sites. They're not random, they form a harmonic sequence. Each site resonates at frequencies that complement the others, as if they were designed to work together as a single system." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A single system spanning the entire globe. "More than that," Dr. Kozloff continued, pulling up a complex waveform analysis. "If all these sites were activated simultaneously, the combined electromagnetic output would create a standing wave pattern around the Earth. The planet itself would become a resonating chamber." The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus thought back to his experience in the King's Chamber, the sense of connecting not just to the pyramid, but to something vast and worldwide. Had he been tapping into a dormant global network that once linked human consciousness across continents? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. I've been analysing historical records of these sites, looking for patterns of suppression. It's remarkable how consistently ancient knowledge about these places has been discouraged." He brought up a timeline on his laptop. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times, always targeting texts about natural philosophy and sacred geometry. The Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed Mayan and Aztec codices that contained astronomical and architectural knowledge. The British Empire consistently relocated indigenous populations away from sites that showed electromagnetic anomalies. Dr. Running Bear's expression darkened. My ancestors were forced from sacred sites across North America. The official reason was always agricultural development or mineral rights, but they consistently targeted places where consciousness-altering experiences were known to occur. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same pattern of suppression he'd encountered with the pyramid's hidden chambers was part of a much larger historical trend. Someone, or some group, had been systematically working for centuries to prevent humanity from rediscovering its technological and spiritual heritage. The question is, Dr. Solomon said quietly, what would happen if we reactivated this network? Dr. Solomon's question haunted Marcus for days. The theoretical implications of reactivating an ancient global consciousness network were staggering, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Most of the sites were under government control, protected by restricted access, or surrounded by modern development that would interfere with their electromagnetic properties. But Marcus couldn't let go of what he'd experienced in the King's Chamber. The sense of expanded awareness, of connection to something vast and ancient, had fundamentally changed his understanding of human potential. If that experience could be replicated and shared, it might represent the next stage of human evolution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Hassan appeared at Marcus's hotel room door early one morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of nervous determination. Doctor, Chen, my family, we have been guardians longer than we have been guides. My great-grandfather, before the British came, before the tourists, he was keeper of the old knowledge. Hassan opened the satchel to reveal documents that made Marcus's breath catch. Hand-drawn maps showing underground passages throughout the Giza Plateau. Detailed diagrams of the pyramid's internal structure, including chambers that weren't on any official archaeological survey, and most remarkably technical drawings that showed how the pyramid systems could be manually activated. The old knowledge, it was never lost completely, Hassan continued. Hidden, yes. Dangerous to speak of, yes. But preserved by families like mine, waiting for someone who could understand its importance. The drawings revealed that the pyramid's consciousness-amplifying effects weren't automatic. They required specific activation procedures. Water had to be introduced into the subterranean chambers at precise volumes and timing. Certain crystals needed to be placed in the sealed chambers to focus the electromagnetic fields. And most crucially, multiple people had to participate simultaneously, their consciousness working together to achieve resonance with the global network. Hassan, this is incredible, but how could we possibly implement it? We'd need access to the sealed chambers, permission for extended stays in the pyramid, and coordination with researchers at sites around the world. Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Dr. Chen, who do you think has been maintaining the pyramid systems all these years? The tourist guides, the security staff, the maintenance workers. Many of us are descendants of the original guardians. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could understand what we have been protecting. Over the next few hours, Hassan revealed the existence of a network of guardians at ancient sites worldwide. Families who had maintained the old knowledge for generations, keeping the sites minimally functional while waiting for the time when they could be fully reactivated. The suppression Marcus had encountered wasn't just from modern governments. It was part of an ancient conflict between those who sought to preserve transformative knowledge and those who feared its implications for existing power structures. But now, Hassan said, his eyes bright with possibility, the time of hiding is ending. The world is ready for the old wisdom to return. Marcus spent the next week in secret meetings with Hassan's network. They showed him hidden passages that connected the pyramids at Giza to underground chambers extending for kilometers beneath the desert. They revealed caches of ancient crystals and metallic components that could be used to restore the pyramid's full functionality. Most remarkably, they demonstrated that they had been maintaining contact with Guardian networks at other sites around the world, using methods that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with modern technology. The plan they developed was audacious beyond anything Marcus had imagined. On the night of the next new moon, when electromagnetic conditions would be optimal, Guardian networks at 12 major sites would simultaneously activate their monuments' consciousness-amplifying systems. The Great Pyramid would serve as the primary node, with Marcus and the research team providing scientific documentation of the process. If successful, the experiment would create the first coordinated activation of the global consciousness network in over 3,000 years. The effects, according to the Guardian's preserved knowledge, would be felt worldwide. A sudden expansion of human awareness that could fundamentally alter the course of civilization. But there were risks. The ancient texts spoke of individuals who had been unprepared for the experience, whose consciousness had been overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. There were warnings about the network attracting the attention of forces that had opposed its use in the past, and there was the very real possibility that modern governments would respond to the activation with force, viewing it as a threat to established order. As Marcus stood in the king's chamber 1 week before the planned activation, surrounded by crystals and metallic components that Hassan's people had been safeguarding for millennia, he realized that he was about to participate in either the most important experiment in human history or the most dangerous. The pyramid hummed around him with renewed energy, its systems responding to the presence of the missing components. Through his consciousness, he could sense the other sites coming online around the world, their guardians preparing for an event that would either herald humanity's next evolutionary leap or mark the end of the Age of Secrets forever. The night of the new moon arrived with unprecedented atmospheric conditions. Aurora activity extended far beyond the polar regions, creating shimmering curtains of light visible even in Egypt's desert sky. Electromagnetic storms disrupted satellite communications worldwide, while seismic monitoring stations detected subtle but synchronized vibrations from ancient sites across the globe. Marcus stood in the king's chamber surrounded by Hassan's Guardian network and the international research team. The chamber had been transformed. Crystalline structures now occupied the corners, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting the subtle light from their instruments. Copper coils, fashioned according to ancient diagrams, had been positioned to enhance the room's natural electromagnetic properties. Most remarkably, water from the Nile's ancient flood channels had been carefully directed into the subterranean chambers, creating the hydraulic pressure needed to activate the pyramid's piezoelectric systems. Dr. Running Bear checked her communication device one final time. Serpent Mound is reporting full activation. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded. Dr. Morrison, monitoring from Newgrange and Ireland, transmitted similar reports. The acoustic resonance here is building beyond our measurement capabilities. The entire mound is vibrating in harmony with frequencies we didn't know existed. Around the world, Guardian networks at sites from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat were reporting the same phenomenon. Ancient monuments that had been dormant for millennia were awakening, their consciousness-amplifying systems responding to coordinated activation for the first time in recorded history. In the king's chamber, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of expanded awareness beginning to build. But this time, it was different, stronger, more focused, and connected to something vast beyond individual consciousness. Through the electromagnetic field generated by the activated pyramid, he could sense the presence of people at the other sites, their awareness merging into a collective experience that transcended physical distance. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring the electromagnetic readings, whispered in amazement, "The standing wave pattern is forming exactly as predicted. The Earth's electromagnetic field is reorganizing itself around these sites." But the experience went beyond scientific measurement. As the network reached full activation, Marcus found his consciousness expanding not just across space but across time. He could sense the pyramid builders themselves, not as historical figures but as present awareness, as if their consciousness had been preserved within the structure itself, waiting for this moment of reactivation. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built a machine for amplifying consciousness, They had created a means of preserving it across millennia. The pyramid was a library of human awareness, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved levels of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach. Through the network, Marcus experienced visions of the ancient world as it had truly been. Not the primitive civilization described in history textbooks, but a global culture connected by consciousness-amplifying technology, capable of feats that seemed magical only because the principles had been forgotten. He saw the construction of the monuments not as slave labour directed by megalomaniacal pharaohs, but as collaborative projects undertaken by people who understood their role in maintaining humanity's connection to higher levels of awareness. Most remarkably, he experienced the reason why the network had been deactivated. As human civilizations became more hierarchical and centralized, the egalitarian consciousness expansion technology had been seen as a threat to emerging power structures. Rulers who depended on controlling information and limiting awareness had systematically dismantled the network, replacing consciousness expanding wisdom traditions with belief systems that emphasized obedience and separation. The suppression hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, coordinated across cultures and centuries by those who understood that widespread access to expanded consciousness would make traditional forms of dominance impossible to maintain. But the network had been designed with safeguards. The consciousness of its builders had been preserved within the structures themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage. That time, Marcus realized, was now. As the activation reached its peak, effects began manifesting around the world. Dr. Running Bear reported that people living near the activated sites were spontaneously experiencing expanded states of consciousness. Emergency services were receiving calls about strange lights and telepathic experiences. Social media was flooded with reports of sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, and experiences of connection that transcended normal human limitations. But there was resistance as well. Military aircraft were scrambling towards several of the activated sites. Government communications were buzzing with references to unauthorized experiments and potential security threats. The same forces that had suppressed the ancient knowledge were mobilizing to contain its return. Hassan, who had been monitoring communications with Guardian networks worldwide, turned to Marcus with urgent concern. Doctor, Chen, we have perhaps 30 minutes before official intervention begins. The network is fully activated, but maintaining it will require ongoing commitment from people around the world. Marcus understood. The ancient network hadn't been maintained by technology alone. It had required conscious participation from people who understood its importance. The reactivation was just the beginning. For the consciousness expanding effects to continue, individuals at sites around the world would need to take responsibility for maintaining the system, despite inevitable opposition from established power structures. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Marcus made his final recordings. The scientific data would be crucial for documenting what had occurred, but the real proof would be the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that the network had initiated. The age of secrets was truly ending. But as Marcus and his team prepared to face the consequences of their world-changing experiment, he realized that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the global awakening, as the media had dubbed it, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Prague, one of dozens of cities where consciousness research centers had spontaneously emerged. Around the world, people who had experienced the network activation had begun gathering, sharing their experiences, and developing new applications for expanded awareness. The official response had been predictable. Governments had classified the event as a coordinated hoax involving atmospheric anomalies and mass suggestion. The Guardian networks had been disbanded, the sites placed under increased security, and several researchers had found their careers and funding mysteriously terminated. But the consciousness genie was out of the bottle. Dr. Running Bear, now leading a consortium of indigenous researchers, had documented over 10,000 cases of enhanced psychic abilities manifesting in people who had been near activated sites. Dr. Kozlov was working with a network of physicists who had detected fundamental changes in quantum field behaviour around former network locations. Even Dr. Morrison, despite losing his university position, continued documenting the ongoing acoustic anomalies at ancient sites worldwide. Most remarkably, people were spontaneously rediscovering consciousness expansion techniques that had been lost for millennia. Meditation practices, acoustic healing methods, and electromagnetic sensitivity training were emerging independently in communities around the globe, as if the network activation had reawakened dormant human capabilities. Hassan had become something of a folk hero in Egypt, his family's guardianship role finally acknowledged by people who had experienced the pyramid's true power. Though official access remained restricted, underground tours of the pyramid's hidden systems had become a pilgrimage for those seeking direct experience of expanded consciousness. Marcus himself had changed profoundly. The night in the activated King's Chamber had left him with permanent access to expanded awareness states. He could sense the electromagnetic fields of other people, communicate telepathically with others who had experienced the network, and access information through methods that conventional science couldn't explain. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at a societal level. The consciousness expansion experienced by millions of people worldwide had created a generation less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and naturally inclined toward cooperation rather than competition. Political movements based on fear and division were finding it increasingly difficult to gain traction. Economic systems that depended on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire were being replaced by resource-sharing networks organised through enhanced human communication abilities. The ancient pyramid builders' greatest achievement wasn't the monuments themselves. It was the civilization they had made possible. A society where expanded consciousness was the norm rather than the exception, where human potential was fully realized, and where technology served to enhance rather than replace natural human capabilities. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for another day of documenting the ongoing transformation, he reflected on the pyramid's true message. The structure itself had been important, but it was ultimately just a tool. The real power had always been within human consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to expand, connect, and transcend the limitations that seemed so absolute. The pyramids had been built not to house the dead, but to awaken the living, and after 4,000 years of slumber, humanity was finally ready to reclaim its birthright. Standing in the Prague sunlight, Marcus could sense the presence of others around the world who had experienced the awakening. Through the invisible network that still connected activated sites, he felt their determination to ensure that the consciousness-expanding knowledge would never again be lost or suppressed. They told us the pyramids were tombs, but standing here, I know that's a lie. This wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to keep the world alive, to preserve and transmit the highest potentials of human consciousness across the millennia, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its forgotten heritage. That time had finally come. The age of expanded consciousness had begun, and no force on earth could put the awakened human spirit back to sleep. The network hummed silently across the globe, connecting minds and hearts in ways that transcended physical distance. The ancient guardian's work was complete. The future of human consciousness stretched ahead like dawn breaking over the desert, infinite with possibility. Marcus smiled, feeling the pyramid's eternal presence in his consciousness, and stepped forward into humanity's transformed tomorrow. Before we begin, I want to give a thank you to Beeblebrox and so many others who suggested this topic. Your ideas fuel these investigations into the shadows of history. If you have suggestions for future videos, drop them in the comments below. We read every single one. What if I told you that the last mission to the moon wasn't Apollo 17? What if 3 astronauts launched in secret, travelled 250,000 miles into the void, and discovered something that fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with space exploration? What if their names were erased, their families silenced, and their discovery buried under layers of classification that remain sealed to this day? This is the story of Apollo 18, the mission that officially never happened, but unofficially changed everything. The year was 1970, and America's love affair with the moon was dying. Apollo 13 had nearly ended in tragedy that April. Commander James Lovell, Command Module pilot Jack Swigert, and Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes had survived an oxygen tank explosion 200,000 miles from home through sheer ingenuity and luck. The nation had held its breath for 4 days, glued to their television sets, watching 3 men fight their way back from the edge of the abyss. They made it. But the close call had rattled Congress. By September 1970, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine stood before the Senate Appropriations Committee with grim news. The remaining Apollo missions, 18, 19 and 20, were being cancelled. Budget constraints, shifting priorities and waning public interest had sealed their fate. The moon program that had captivated the world was ending, not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper. Or so the public was told. Behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. In the basement archives of the Johnson Space Center, there exists a document that most people will never see. It's labelled NASA SP4029, a dry budget reconciliation report from fiscal year 1971. Most of it contains exactly what you'd expect. Columns of numbers, departmental allocations, contractor payments. But on page 247, there's an anomaly. 3 line items totaling $287 million are listed under Specialized Systems Transfer Classified Program Support. The receiving account is identified only by a code, LB73DOD Liberty Bell. Project Liberty Bell was a joint Department of Defense and NASA initiative, supervised by 2 organizations that rarely appear in public documents: the Office of Space Science and Applications and the National Reconnaissance Office. The NRO, for those unfamiliar, is America's spy satellite agency, so secret that its very existence wasn't officially acknowledged until 1992. What would NASA and America's most classified intelligence agency want with nearly $300 million and a cancelled moon mission? The answer lay in the Cold War's most dangerous game: nuclear detection. Throughout the early 1970s, American intelligence analysts were desperate to monitor Soviet nuclear testing. Satellite surveillance helped, but seismic detection remained the gold standard for identifying underground detonations. The problem was geography. Soviet test sites in Kazakhstan and Novaya Zemlya were geologically shielded, making detection difficult from Earth-based sensors. But what about sensors that weren't on Earth? The moon offered a unique advantage. Its stable, airless environment and low seismic noise made it an ideal platform for detecting faint vibrations across vast distances. More importantly, the moon's orbit around Earth meant that sensors could monitor Soviet territory during windows, when traditional surveillance was blind. Project Liberty Bell's mission was simple: place advanced seismic relay equipment on the lunar surface, disguised as abandoned Apollo hardware, and use it to monitor Soviet nuclear activity. They would need a crew, 3 men willing to risk everything for a mission that could never be acknowledged. Commander Richard Anderson had been the backup pilot for Apollo 16. At 41, he was older than most astronauts, a Korean War veteran with silver temples, and the kind of steady calm that made younger pilots defer to him without question. He'd spent 2 years training for a moon landing that never came, watching as younger crews got the glory while he remained earthbound. When a 2-star general from the Department of Defense showed up at his Houston office in March 1973 with a manila folder marked Eyes Only, Anderson didn't hesitate. He was being offered what every astronaut dreams of: a mission to the moon. The the fact that it was classified only made it more appealing. James Hall was different. A former Air Force test pilot, Hall had been assigned to the Manned Orbital Laboratory, the Air Force's secret space station program, before it was cancelled in 1969. He was 38, dark-haired, intense, with the kind of technical precision that made him NASA's go-to pilot for experimental systems. Hall had grown up reading Tom Swift novels and watching Flash Gordon serials. He joined the Air Force specifically to fly higher and faster than anyone else. When NASA recruited him after MOL's cancellation, he jumped at the chance. Hall was the command module pilot responsible for keeping the spacecraft alive while his crewmates descended to the surface. The third crew member was Marcus Kell, and he was an outsider. Kell wasn't military. He was a civilian geologist from the United States Geological Survey's Astrogeology Center in Flagstaff, Arizona. At 35, he'd spent a decade mapping lunar terrain from photographs, preparing traverse routes for astronauts who would walk on a stone he'd only studied from afar. Kell was wiry, intense, with thick-framed glasses and a habit of speaking in rapid-fire technical jargon that left his colleagues scrambling to keep up. NASA needed a geologist who could identify the best locations for seismic equipment and collect samples that would justify the mission's scientific cover story. Kell was brilliant, obsessive, and, crucially, unmarried with no children. His disappearance, if necessary, would cause minimal civilian disruption. The crew trained in isolation at a classified facility in Nevada, using equipment labelled as Skylab backup hardware. They studied maps of Mare Moscoviense, a far-side lunar basin that would provide their equipment with an unobstructed view of Soviet territory. They practiced deploying sensor packages disguised as standard Apollo science experiments, and they were briefed on what to do if they found something unexpected. Unlikely, the briefing officer had said, a CIA analyst whose name none of them caught. But the Soviets have had multiple lunar probes in the region. If you encounter any foreign hardware, photograph it, catalogue it, and bring back samples if possible. Do not attempt to interact with it directly. Anderson had raised an eyebrow. What kind of samples? The analyst's expression hadn't changed. Anything unusual. Anything that doesn't match baseline lunar geology. Anything that appears manufactured or processed. You think the Soviets built something up there? We think it's prudent to be prepared for any scenario. That should have been the first warning. Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center had seen better days. By December 1973, it had been more than a year since the last Saturn V had thundered skyward, carrying Apollo 17. The massive gantry stood silent, a rusting monument to a program that had conquered the moon, and then simply stopped. Tourists visiting the Space Center were told that 39B was being reconfigured for Skylab support operations. A plausible enough story, given that America's space station was still operational. What the tourists didn't see was the nighttime activity. Starting in November, unmarked trucks began arriving after dark, delivering components wrapped in protective shrouding. The vehicle assembly building's high bay doors would open just long enough to admit the cargo, then seal shut. Armed Air Force security police established a perimeter that extended far beyond the normal restricted zone. On the morning of December 7th, 1973, NASA issued a press release announcing a systems compatibility test for Skylab backup hardware, scheduled for December 11th. The test would use vehicle SA-515, one of the unused Saturn V rockets, to verify orbital insertion procedures for potential future space station missions. It was a lie wrapped in technical jargon, and it worked perfectly. SA-515 was real. It had been constructed but never assigned to a mission. The Skylab story was plausible enough that the handful of space journalists who still covered NASA didn't dig deeper, and the December timing was deliberate. The Soviet Union's tracking stations would be focused on their own Soyuz 13 mission, currently in orbit. The crew arrived at the operations and checkout building at 0300 hours on December 11th. They'd spent the previous week in medical quarantine, officially to prevent any illness that might compromise the test flight, unofficially to prevent them from talking to anyone outside the mission loop. Anderson remembered the walk to the transfer van. The air was warm and humid, typical for Florida in December. carrying the salt smell of the Atlantic. Above them, stars blazed in a moonless sky. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were about to fly to the moon on a night when the moon itself was new, invisible from Earth. The suit technicians worked in silence, checking seals and connections with the efficient precision of people who'd done this dozens of times. But there were differences. The mission patches on their suits bore no designation, just the NASA logo. Their names weren't embroidered on the chest, just their surnames and a cryptic alphanumeric: Anderson's D73, Hall SD73, Kells D73, SD73, Silent Dawn 1973. The elevator ride to the White Room seemed to take forever. Anderson's heart rate was elevated. He could hear it in his helmet's biomedical sensors, but steady. Hall was actually calmer than during simulations, his vital signs rock solid. Kell, predictably, was running hot, excitement overriding any nervousness. At 0522 hours, the crew entered the command module. They'd named it Endeavour, after Captain Cook's ship of exploration. The lunar module, still folded in the adapter below them, was Orpheus, the Greek hero who descended into the underworld and almost made it back. Another name that should have been a warning. The launch was textbook perfect. At 0631 hours, the Saturn V's 5 F1 engines ignited in a carefully sequenced cascade, producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The flame trench beneath the pad redirected the exhaust in a searing river of fire. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the rocket strained against the hold-down arms, every component vibrating with barely contained violence. Then the arms released and Apollo 18 began to rise. Inside the command module, the crew was slammed into their seats by acceleration that built from 1G to 4Gs in a matter of seconds. The rocket's roar was so loud it transcended sound, becoming something physical, a pressure that invaded their bones. Outside the windows, the gantry dropped away with startling speed, replaced by sky transitioning from black to dark blue to brilliant azure. 2 minutes and 42 seconds after liftoff, the first stage separated, its fuel exhausted. The sudden change from brutal acceleration to relative weightlessness made Anderson's stomach lurch, but he kept his focus on the instruments. The second stage ignited smoothly, pushing them higher and faster. 11 minutes after leaving Earth, they were in orbit. The official NASA tracking data for December 11th, 1973 shows only routine Skylab telemetry. There's no mention of a Saturn V launch, no tracking data for a translunar injection burn, no acknowledgement that 3 men had just begun a 250,000-mile journey. But NORAD knew. Their radar installations had tracked every second of the ascent. The data was immediately classified, rerouted to a Department of Defense server that would remain sealed for decades. At mission elapsed time 2 hours, 44 minutes and 16 seconds, while passing over the Pacific Ocean on their second orbit, Endeavour's service propulsion system engine ignited for the translunar injection burn. For 5 minutes and 48 seconds, the engine pushed them faster and faster, until they'd exceeded Earth's escape velocity. They were committed now, the moon or nothing. The 3-day coast to lunar orbit was simultaneously routine and surreal. They performed the usual systems checks, verified course corrections, practiced lunar module procedures. But there was no television coverage, no interviews with Walter Cronkite, no excited updates from Mission Control played on every radio station in America. Just them, alone in the void, following a trajectory that officially didn't exist. Flight Director Glyn Lunny oversaw the mission from a specially secured control room at Johnson Space Center. Lunny was a veteran of every Apollo mission since Apollo 7, a brilliant, unflappable leader who'd guided Apollo 13 home when disaster struck. If anyone could be trusted with the most classified mission in NASA's history, it was Lunny. But even Lunny wasn't prepared for what came next. Apollo 18 entered lunar orbit on December the 9th, 1973, at 17:23 mission elapsed time. The lunar orbit insertion burn was perfect, placing them in a 60 by 170 mile elliptical orbit that would be circularized before the landing attempt. Through their windows, the moon's surface scrolled past in stark blacks and greys, utterly lifeless, utterly alien. All remained in Endeavour while Anderson and Kell transferred into Orpheus, the lunar module that would take them to the surface. The undocking went smoothly, and Orpheus began its descent toward Mare Moscoviense. Mare Moscoviense, the Sea of Moscow, is one of the Moon's most distinctive farside features. Unlike the familiar Maria visible from Earth, this impact basin is relatively small, only 270 miles across. But it contains unusual magnetic anomalies that had puzzled scientists for years. The mission planners had chosen it precisely because those anomalies might mask the electronic signatures of the surveillance equipment. But what they didn't know was that the anomalies had a different source entirely. Orpheus touched down at 23:41 mission elapsed time, landing near the basin's southern rim where magnetic readings were strongest. Anderson's voice was steady as he reported, "Houston, Orpheus. The Eagle has landed." A deliberate echo of Armstrong's famous words, a private acknowledgement of the legacy they carried. "Copy that, Orpheus," came Lunny's response, his voice encrypted and relayed through a satellite network that bore no official connection to NASA. "You're go for EVA in 6 hours. Get some rest." But Anderson was staring out the window at something that didn't make sense. The landing site briefings had shown a relatively smooth area of mare basalt, perfect for deploying equipment. What he saw instead was irregular. The regolith, the dusty lunar soil, showed patterns. Not natural wind patterns, obviously, since the Moon has no atmosphere, but linear features, geometric arrangements that looked almost like... "Houston, we have some unusual surface characteristics here," Anderson transmitted. "Request permission to move EVA-1 up to 0300 MET. A long pause, then... "Negative, Orpheus. Stick to the timeline. You need rest." Anderson exchanged a glance with Kell through their helmets. The geologist's eyes were wide behind his visor, fixed on the same patterns Anderson had noticed. "Copy that, Houston," Anderson said. But he knew neither of them would sleep. 4 hours later, they were suiting up anyway. The first EVAs officially began at 3:17 mission elapsed time. Anderson descended the ladder first, pausing on the bottom rung to deliver the words he'd rehearsed 100 times. "I step onto this ancient surface in the spirit of discovery and in the service of my country. No poetry, no giant leap for mankind." This was a military operation, and his words reflected that. Kell followed, immediately setting up the camera that would document their activities. Unlike previous Apollo missions, this footage would never be broadcast, but it needed to exist for post-mission analysis. They worked efficiently, deploying the seismic equipment packages with the practiced precision of countless simulations. The equipment looked identical to the ALS-EP science packages from earlier missions, but these units contained classified sensors designed to detect specific frequencies associated with nuclear detonations. It was while planting the third sensor array that Kell's voice cut across the radio, sharp with surprise. "Commander, you need to see this." Anderson bounded over in the lunar gravity's lazy arc. Kell was kneeling, or as close to kneeling as the suit allowed, next to an outcrop of rock that protruded from the regolith at an odd angle. "What am I looking at?" Anderson asked. Kell reached out with a gloved hand, brushing dust away from the rock's surface. Except it wasn't rock. The surface was metallic, not meteoritic iron, which Anderson had seen in photographs from previous missions. This was processed metal, showing what looked like machining marks, precise angles that didn't occur in nature. "Houston," Kell transmitted, his voice carefully controlled despite the excitement Anderson could hear underneath. "Surface sample at Station 3 shows unusual characteristics. Structure appears engineered, not geological. Recommend immediate sample collection and detailed photography." The response from Houston was immediate. "Say again, Orpheus. Did you say engineered?" "Affirmative, Houston. The sample shows evidence of..." The transmission cut out, not static, not interference, just silence. Anderson checked his radio. All lights green. He could hear Kell's breathing on the short-range suit-to-suit frequency. But Houston was gone. Then Kell's hand shot out, gripping Anderson's arm hard enough that he felt it through the suit's layers. "Commander," Kell whispered, even though there was no one to overhear in the Moon's vacuum. "It's warm." That was impossible. The lunar surface temperature in sunlight reaches 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cook you in an unprotected suit. In shadow, it plunges to minus 280, but objects don't generate their own heat, not naturally. Anderson placed his own glove against the metal surface. Through the suit's insulation, he shouldn't have felt anything. But Kell was right. There was heat. Not scorching, but present. Unmistakable. Active. "We need to document this," Anderson said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Full photography, spectroscopy if we can get readings. Then we collect samples and—" Kell wasn't listening. He'd moved around the outcrop, brushing away more regolith, revealing more of the structure beneath. It was massive. What they'd seen was just the tip, the exposed edge of something that extended down into the lunar surface. And now that Anderson's eyes had adjusted, he could see that the patterns in the regolith weren't random. They radiated out from this central point, like ripples in a pond, or like something had disturbed the dust when it powered up. Anderson's training took over. Document. Analyze. Report. He began photographing the structure from multiple angles, while Kell used the portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer to analyze the metal's composition. The readings made no sense. The XRF showed titanium, but not any titanium alloy in their reference database. The crystalline structure was too regular, too perfect. Whatever this was, it hadn't been formed by natural processes. "Orpheus, this is Houston. Do you copy?" The transmission crackled back to life and Anderson nearly jumped. "Houston, Orpheus, we copy. We experienced a 14-minute communication dropout." "Negative, Orpheus. We show continuous telemetry. Your biomedical readouts went offline for 14 minutes, but voice communication remained nominal from our end." Anderson and Kell exchanged another look. They'd been shouting at Houston for 14 minutes with no response. Houston claimed they'd maintained contact the whole time. Someone was lying, or something had interfered with the transmission in a way that affected both ends differently. "Houston, we have a situation here. We've uncovered what appears to be an artificial structure, possibly Soviet in origin, showing—" "Orpheus, cease that work immediately." A new voice, not Lunny, harder, military. "You are to collect the minimum required samples, photograph the area, and return to the LM immediately. Do you understand?" Anderson felt something cold settle in his chest. "Houston, we need more time to properly document." "Orpheus, that is a direct order. Return to the lunar module. Now!" The voice left no room for argument. They collected samples. 6 core tubes, each carefully sealed and labelled. Kell wanted to take more, to excavate deeper, to really understand what they'd found. Anderson had to physically pull him away. The climb back up the ladder felt wrong. They were leaving something behind, something that rewrote everything humanity thought it knew about the moon, and they were just walking away. Inside Orpheus, they pressurized the cabin and removed their helmets. Kell's face was flushed, his eyes bright with excitement and frustration. "We found something," he said. "Something that proves we're not alone. And they're ordering us to—" "To follow orders," Anderson interrupted. "We're military personnel on a classified mission. We document, we report, we let the analysts make the calls. But nothing. We've got the samples, we've got photographs, we've done our job." Anderson began the post-EVA system check, his hands moving through the familiar routine while his mind raced. What had they found? Soviet equipment was the obvious answer, but the heat signature didn't fit. The Soviets had landed lunar probes in the region, but those were automated samplers, not powered installations, and the metal composition was wrong for Soviet manufacturing, which left possibilities that Anderson didn't want to think about. The return to orbit was scheduled for 16 hours later, giving them time to rest and prepare, but neither man could sleep. They sat in the cramped cabin, occasionally glancing at the sample containers, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Kell who finally broke the silence. What if it's not Soviet? Anderson didn't answer. I mean, think about it. The magnetic anomalies in this region have been documented since the early orbital surveys. That's decades before either us or the Soviets had the capability to land anything here. What if those anomalies weren't natural? What if they were marking something? Marking what? Kell met his eyes. "I don't know, but whatever that structure is, it's old. Really old. The regolith accumulation around it suggests it's been here for millennia, maybe longer. Nothing human built that. The words hung in the cabin like a physical presence. Before Anderson could respond, the radio crackled. Orpheus, Houston. We're showing an anomalous reading from your cabin environmental system. Confirm pressure holding steady. Anderson checked the gauges. Everything nominal. Houston, we show all systems green. Pressure is... He stopped. The cabin pressure gauge was dropping. Not rapidly, but definitely dropping. We have a leak, he said, his voice flat with the kind of calm that comes from years of training for disasters. Rate is approximately 0.3 psi per minute. Beginning emergency leak check procedures. They work systematically, checking every seal, every valve, every fitting. The leak wasn't in any of the obvious places, and the rate was increasing. Kell found it first. The primary hatch seal, which had been perfect before EVA, now showed signs of degradation. The rubber gasket looked corroded, eaten away by something. Houston, we found the leak source. Primary hatch seal shows unexpected deterioration. We're going to need to execute early ascent before we lose too much atmosphere. Another new voice from Houston, this one with a slight Texas accent. Orpheus, this is Flight Surgeon. Your biomedical readouts are showing elevated heart rates and core temperatures. Are you experiencing any unusual symptoms? Dizziness, nausea, visual disturbances? Anderson did a mental inventory. He felt fine. Anxious certainly, but that was justified given their situation. Negative, Houston. We feel nominal. Copy that, Orpheus. Be advised, we're seeing markers in your blood chemistry that weren't present pre-EVA. We'll need detailed post-flight medical analysis. Something in the samples, Anderson thought. Something from the structure. It had gotten into their suits, into their gloves. Microscopic particles that were now in the cabin with them. Houston, request immediate return to orbit. We need to rendezvous with Endeavour as soon as possible. Copy, Orpheus. You are go for immediate ascent. Hall is manoeuvring into position now. The launch from the lunar surface was violent and brief. Orpheus's ascent stage engine fired, blasting them away from the descent stage and back toward orbit. Through the window, Anderson caught one last glimpse of the landing site, the disturbed regolith, the exposed structure that was already being buried again by dust their ascent engine had kicked up. Evidence vanishing beneath lunar soil, perhaps never to be seen again. The rendezvous went perfectly. Hall had positioned Endeavour precisely, and the docking was textbook smooth. But when Anderson opened the tunnel between the two spacecraft, Hall immediately sealed his helmet. Don't come through, Hall said, his voice tight. Not yet. Jim, we need to transfer the samples and... I said not yet. Hall's eyes were hard. Houston gave me direct orders. You two stay in the LM until we've run full biological protocols. Kell's laugh was bitter. Biological protocols? We're in a vacuum. There's nothing alive on the moon. Then you won't mind waiting while we make sure. Hall disappeared from the tunnel, and they heard the hatch seal from Endeavour's side. They were quarantined in space, 250,000 miles from home. The next 6 hours were a nightmare of waiting. Houston ran them through endless medical checks, drawing blood samples using the onboard medical kit, analysing biomarkers for anything unusual. The results kept coming back with the same message. Anomalous proteins, unknown compounds, cellular changes that shouldn't be possible. Finally, Hall's voice came through the radio. Houston is ordering you to jettison the sample containers. What? Kell exploded. No! Those samples are the whole reason we're here. Those samples are contaminated with something that Houston's medical team can't identify. They pose an unacceptable biological risk. Anderson felt something inside him crack. They'd risked everything, found something that rewrote human understanding of the cosmos, and now they were being ordered to throw it into space like radioactive waste. Houston, this is Commander Anderson. Request clarification. Are you ordering us to destroy evidence of possible extraterrestrial intelligence? The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Then, negative. Orpheus? We're ordering you to protect the Earth from potential contamination. You don't know what you brought back. Neither do we, and we can't risk it reaching the atmosphere. We have containment protocols. The sample containers are sealed. The containers were sealed. Past tense. We're reading chemical changes in the seals similar to what happened to your hatch. Whatever degraded your gaskets is degrading the sample containers. You have maybe 12 hours before those seals fail completely." Kell was staring at the sample containers like they were his children being sentenced to death. "There has to be another way. We could transfer them to Endeavour's storage, use the—" "Negative. All samples are to be jettisoned immediately. That's a direct order from the highest levels of command." Anderson understood then. This wasn't about protecting Earth. This was about protecting a secret. Whatever they'd found, someone had decided it was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too world-changing to ever reach the public. "Commander," Kell said quietly, don't do this." Anderson met his eyes. "I'm sorry." He began opening the sample containers one by one, using the LM's waste disposal chute to vent them into space. Core samples that might have contained proof of ancient intelligence, photographs, spectroscopic data, all of it fed into the void, all except one. While Kell's attention was on the gauges, Anderson palmed one of the smaller containers, a sample of the metallic structure itself. He tucked it into a maintenance access panel, a space meant for tools that would never be inspected during post-flight analysis. If they were going to bury this, at least one piece of evidence would survive. The transfer to Endeavour finally happened 18 hours after docking. By then, both Anderson and Kell were exhausted, their suits contaminated, their bodies showing increasingly unusual biomarker readings that Houston's doctors couldn't explain. Hall had set up a makeshift containment barrier using plastic sheeting and duct tape, separating the cabin into clean and contaminated zones. It was absurd, primitive, and probably ineffective. But it was all they had. The trans-Earth injection burn was scheduled for 36 hours after landing, giving them time to rest and prepare for the journey home. But Anderson couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes he saw that structure, that impossible architecture buried beneath lunar dust. And he heard the sound. It had been so faint during EVA that he'd dismissed it as radio interference. But now, in the quiet of the command module, he realized what it was. A vibration, subsonic, barely on the edge of perception. It came from the direction of Mare Moscovians, cycling at regular intervals. A heartbeat. Something on the moon had a heartbeat. "Houston," he transmitted. "Request permission to conduct extended orbital survey of the landing site region before TEI burn." "Negative, Orpheus. You're to execute TEI on schedule and return to Earth immediately." "Houston, we're detecting unusual." "Orpheus." The voice was hard, final. "This conversation is over. Execute TEI on schedule, or we will be forced to conclude that you are medically unfit for command. Do you understand?" It was a threat. Refuse, and they'd declare him incompetent, remove him from command, potentially send Hall back alone, while Anderson and Kell were left in orbit to die. "Copy, Houston. We'll execute TEI on schedule." The burn went perfectly. Endeavour's service propulsion system fired for exactly 2 minutes and 33 seconds, accelerating them out of lunar orbit and onto a trajectory that would bring them home in 3 days. As the moon shrank in their rear window, Anderson saw Hall staring back at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. Regret? Fear? Wonder? "We should have stayed," Hall said quietly. "We should have refused the order and stayed to figure out what that thing was." "We'd be dead in a week," Anderson replied. "No resupply, no rescue mission. NASA would just say we never launched." "Maybe." Hall turned away from the window. "Or maybe we'd have learned something worth dying for." The re-entry was routine until it wasn't. They'd separated the service module and positioned the command module heat shield forward, exactly as planned. The entry corridor was perfect, 32 degrees off vertical, threading the needle between burning up from too steep an angle and bouncing off the atmosphere from too shallow. Anderson felt the first hints of deceleration, the gentlest push against his restraints as they kissed the upper atmosphere. Then, stronger. The G-forces built from 1 to 4 to 6, pressing them into their couches. Outside the windows, plasma began to form, a sheath of ionized air that glowed orange, then white, then an eye-searing blue-white that turned the cabin into a furnace. This was the moment when communication cut out, a normal blackout caused by the plasma sheath. It usually lasted about 4 minutes. It lasted 9. When the radio finally crackled back to life, The voice that came through wasn't mission control in Houston. It was a different frequency, a different operator. Endeavour, this is USS New Orleans. Do you copy? The New Orleans. Anderson knew that ship. It had recovered Apollo 14 in 1971, back when recovery operations were public events covered by every news outlet in the country. New Orleans, Endeavour, we copy. What's our position? You're approximately 600 miles east of projected landing zone. We're vectoring to your position now. ETA 90 minutes. 600 miles off course. That was impossible. Their navigation had been perfect, their trajectory dead on. Unless someone had changed the trajectory while they were in blackout. The capsule splashed down hard, slamming into the Pacific swells with enough force to rattle Anderson's teeth. The cabin tilted, rolled, then settled into the stable flotation position, with the heat shield down and the hatch pointing toward the sky. Through the window, Anderson could see a grey Pacific morning, overcast skies, and in the distance the angular silhouette of a Navy recovery ship, approaching at flank speed. But there was something wrong with the ship's profile. It was carrying more than the usual complement of boats and helicopters, and the deck configuration didn't match a standard Apollo recovery setup. Endeavour, remain in the capsule. Do not, repeat, do not open the hatch. Recovery swimmers are approaching with biological containment protocols. Hall's voice was tight. Biological containment. What the hell is going on? Anderson already knew. Someone had decided they were contaminated. Not just their suits, not just the samples. Them. The swimmers arrived wearing full hazmat suits, not the normal wetsuits of recovery teams. They attached a flotation collar to the capsule, then spent 30 minutes rigging what looked like a flexible containment tunnel from the hatch to a boat alongside. "Gentlemen," came a new voice, calm and clinical. "I'm Colonel Matthews, biomedical officer for this recovery operation. You're going to open the hatch, proceed through the containment tunnel, and board the boat. Do not remove your flight suits. Do not touch any of the recovery personnel. Is that understood?" "Understood," Anderson replied, because there was no point in arguing. The transfer was surreal. They shuffled through a plastic tunnel that swayed with every wave, climbed into a boat where personnel in hazmat suits directed them to sealed benches, then rowed in silence to the New Orleans. The ship had been modified. An entire section of the deck had been enclosed with plastic sheeting and negative pressure ventilation units. They were led through multiple decontamination chambers, each one more thorough than the last. Showers, chemical rinses, medical examinations that lasted hours. Finally, they were placed in isolation chambers, essentially hospital rooms sealed behind airlocks. They could see each other through thick glass windows, but they couldn't talk, couldn't touch, couldn't share the experience of what they'd witnessed. Anderson spent 3 days in that room before the visit started. Men in suits. No names, no badges, just folders full of documents that needed signatures. Non-disclosure agreements, medical waivers, legal instruments that essentially erased Apollo 18 from history. "Your families have been notified of a training accident," one of the suits explained. His voice was flat, bureaucratic. "You'll be listed as killed in a helicopter crash at Ellington Field. There will be closed casket funerals. Your wives will receive full benefits and pensions." "We're not dead," Anderson said. "Officially you are. Unofficially you'll be relocated, given new identities, and placed under permanent monitoring. What you found on the moon remains classified under national security protocols that supersede any oath you've ever taken." Kell, in the next chamber, was pounding on the glass. Anderson could see his mouth moving, forming words that were probably profane. Hall just sat on his bed, staring at nothing. "What about the samples?" Anderson asked. "What did your analysis show?" The suit's expression didn't change. There were no samples. The mission never happened. You were never on the moon. But Anderson had hidden one sample. He knew they'd find it eventually. They'd tear apart every inch of the command module during the accident investigation. But maybe it would buy enough time for someone to study it, to understand what they'd found. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, the isolation ended. Not because they were cleared, but because the decision had been made. Anderson was taken to a debriefing room where a 3-star general he didn't recognise sat across a metal table. "The capsule burned during recovery," the general said. "Onboard fire, very tragic. All physical evidence was destroyed. The descent stage on the moon will be listed in records as Apollo 17 hardware. Any lunar reconnaissance that spots it will be explained as a mapping error. You can't erase what we saw. We can. We have. And we will. The General slid a folder across the table. These are your new lives. Study them. Become them. Because if you ever speak about Apollo 18 to anyone, your families, your friends, a priest, a journalist, anyone, you'll disappear. Not into isolation, not into prison. You'll just disappear. Are we clear? They were clear. Richard Anderson became Robert Andrews, a civil engineering consultant in Seattle. He never remarried. He spent his evenings in a small apartment overlooking Puget Sound, watching the moon rise over the water and remembering what it felt like to stand on that ancient surface. James Hall became John Henderson, a flight instructor in Arizona. He taught teenagers to fly Cessnas and tried not to think about the spacecraft he'd piloted through the void. Marcus Kell became Martin Cole, a high school science teacher in Maine. He taught geology to bored sophomores and died a little inside every time they asked if anyone had ever found evidence of life beyond Earth. They never saw each other again. The agencies made sure of that. But they weren't the only ones who knew. In 1981, a NASA technician named Eldon Nichols was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. He was 82 years old, a veteran of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, and he'd been present at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii when the Apollo 18 crew was brought ashore. Before he died, Nichols gave an interview to a freelance journalist named Patricia Morrison. The interview was never published. Morrison's editor killed the story, her notes mysteriously disappeared from her apartment, and she received a visit from two men who strongly suggested she find a different career. But Morrison remembered what Nichols had told her. He'd seen biological containment canisters being loaded onto a C-141 Starlifter, military personnel in full hazmat suits, and one canister marked with stenciled letters, Lunar Origin. Viable. Something living. Something they'd brought back from the moon. Morrison spent the next decade trying to verify Nichols' story. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests that were denied. She tracked down other technicians who'd been at Hickam, but they all claimed ignorance or refused to talk. She even tried to locate the crew of Apollo 18, but their records had been scrubbed so thoroughly it was as if they'd never existed. She died in 1994 in a car accident that police ruled mechanical failure. Her research materials were never found. In 2009, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter began mapping the moon's surface in unprecedented detail. The images were released to the public, allowing anyone with an internet connection to explore humanity's ancient footsteps on another world. A graduate student at MIT named David Chen was studying images of Mare Moscoviense when he noticed something unusual. Debris patterns that didn't match any documented landing site. Geometric arrangements in the regolith that suggested a descent stage, but in a location where no Apollo mission had officially landed. Chen published his findings in a small astronomy journal. The article got 17 views before the journal's website crashed. When it came back online 3 days later, the article was gone. Chen's faculty advisor suggested he focus on different research for his dissertation, but Chen had made copies. He shared them on forums, sent them to other researchers, uploaded them to file-sharing sites. The images kept disappearing, accounts got suspended, websites went offline, someone was watching, someone was listening. Robert Andrews died in 2019, at the age of 87. Heart failure, the death certificate said. Peaceful, in his sleep. His apartment was cleaned out by a professional service hired by the government. Most of his possessions were unremarkable. Books, furniture, the accumulated debris of a quiet life. But in a drawer hidden behind a false panel in his desk, they found a journal. The journal was confiscated immediately, classified, and locked away in a facility that doesn't appear on any map. But Andrews had been careful. He'd made a copy, sealed it in a waterproof container, and buried it in a public park in Seattle, with coordinates encoded in a letter he'd sent to his estranged daughter years before. She found it in 2023 after finally deciphering her father's cryptic final message. She read about Apollo 18, about the structure on the moon, about the cover-up that had stolen her father's identity and his life. She tried to go public. The story was picked up by a few conspiracy websites, dismissed as elaborate fiction, and quickly forgotten in the endless churn of internet content. But someone else was paying attention. In October 2024, a private lunar communications satellite detected an anomalous signal emanating from Mare Moscoviense. The signal was faint, barely distinguishable from background radiation, but it was there, and it was repeating. The satellite's operators ran the signal through enhancement algorithms, filtering out noise, amplifying the coherent patterns. What emerged made them contact NASA immediately. It was a voice, human, male, transmitted on the S-band frequency that Apollo missions had used for communication. NASA's official response was immediate denial, equipment malfunction, atmospheric reflection of old transmissions, radio hobbyists with too much time. But the recording leaked anyway. It always does. The transmission lasted exactly 18 seconds. The voice was calm, almost resigned, distorted by decades of degradation and the interference of space. This is Commander Richard Anderson, Apollo 18. If anyone receives this, know that we were never alone up here. The structure at Mare Moscoviense is not Soviet, it's not human. It's old, older than our species, older than our civilization, and it's still active. We thought we were explorers, but we were trespassers. Whatever we awakened, it's still watching. It's always been watching. To anyone planning to return to the moon, be careful what you wake up. Anderson out. The recording has been analysed by audio forensics experts. Some claim it's authentic, a genuine transmission from 1973 that somehow got stored in the moon's magnetic field and released decades later. Others insist it's a hoax, an elaborate fake created by conspiracy theorists with access to vintage NASA equipment. NASA refuses to comment beyond their initial denial, but in the sealed archives, in the folders marked Eyes Only, there's a 1974 memo from the National Reconnaissance Office to the President of the United States. The memo is brief, just 3 paragraphs, but the final line reads, "Recommend permanent cessation of crewed lunar exploration. Object designated Artifact 1 remains active and demonstrates awareness of human presence. Further contact inadvisable until we better understand its nature and intentions." The memo is stamped approved. That's why we haven't been back to the moon in over 50 years. Not because of budget constraints or shifting priorities or lack of public interest. We haven't gone back because something is waiting there. Something ancient and patient and utterly incomprehensible. And somewhere in the classified depths of government servers, monitoring systems watch Mare Moscoviense 24 hours a day, waiting for the structure to wake up again. Waiting for the signal that will tell us whether that first contact was a greeting or a warning. In a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona, an 89-year-old flight instructor named John Henderson sits by a window, watching the moon rise over the desert. He hasn't spoken in 3 years. Stroke, the doctors say. But his eyes are clear, and sometimes the nurses catch him staring at the moon with an expression they can't quite identify. Fear, longing, recognition. On clear nights when the moon is full, Henderson's heart rate increases. The monitors beep faster, and sometimes, if you're very quiet, you can hear him whispering the same thing over and over. It's still warm, it's still warm, it's still warm. No one knows what he means, but somewhere on the moon, in a basin named for a city most people have never seen, something ancient stirs in the dust, waiting, watching. Remembering the day 3 humans came, discovered its existence and fled back to their distant blue world. Next time, it won't let them leave.